Who's having a good day? Getting some great stuff to take back? I'm so thrilled. That's wonderful. Well, we have a very special session for you right now. You are getting something hot off the press. As you know, our new California History Social Science Framework was adopted in July, and we're getting ready to roll it out and get new information out. And so I am thrilled that we have this fabulous panel here to give you the heads up. You're going to be one of the first ones out the gate in the state to hear front and center about the excitement around this framework. Let me introduce our panel for you, and then we're going to get moving and giving you the most current, up-to-date information here for you. On my far right, we have Stephanie Gregson, who's the Director of the Curriculum Frameworks and Instructional Resources Division and the Executive Director of the Instructional Quality Commission. She has extensive experience in education. She's been a teacher, principal, and curriculum specialist. Before joining the California Department of Ed, her most recent position was Director of Curriculum Assessment and Learning for the Davis Joint Unified School District. She received her BA and MA from Sacramento State University and is completing her doctorate in Curriculum Instruction Assessment through Walden University. Join me in welcoming Stephanie Gregson. Sitting to her left, we are so privileged to have Dr. Eileen Strauss, who is currently Vice President of the California State Board of Education. She's been a teacher, a school principal, and university professor. She was Assistant Superintendent for Educational Services in the Beverly Hills Unified School District prior to being appointed to the State Board. She received her bachelor's degree in elementary teaching credential from UCLA. Joanne Iskin is here too from UCLA. She received her master's in educational administration from CSU Northridge and doctorate in educational leadership from USC. She was a principal, she's a local gal to us, so was a principal at Lincoln Middle School in Santa Monica for 16 years, leading the school to national distinction as the Disney School of the Year. It was recognized also as a National Blue Ribbon School of Excellence, twice recognized as a California Distinguished School. She was named the California Secondary Principal of the Year in 1991. Later became Chief Education Officer and Principal of Santa Monica High School, directed the redesign of the large comprehensive high school into 6 smaller learning communities, helping the school to raise its academic performance significantly with all subgroups. Quite an accomplishment. The U.S. Department of Ed declared the school a national model for high school redesign, and Newsweek named it one of the country's top 300 performing high schools. Dr. Strauss next served as Senior Director of Secondary Education for Santa Monica Malibu Unified School District before joining Beverly Hills Unified as Assistant Superintendent. Teaches graduate courses at CSU Northridge, USC, Loyola Marymount, and of course, currently, where, Joanne? At UCLA. So please join and let's thank Dr. Strauss for joining us. So we got some good street creds here, to be sure. We're also very excited to have Beth Slutsky with us. Dr. Slutsky is with the California History Social Science Project, the Department of History at UC Davis. So thank you, Beth, for joining us today. And we have the ever-famous Rob Vicario, who's my counterpart as Coordinator of History, Social Science, of Instructional Services at Orange County Department of Ed. So thank you, Rob, for coming. And here's my good friend Marshall Crotty, who is the president of the Constitutional Rights Foundation and co-director of the California Civic Mission of Schools. Marshall has over 35 years experience in the fields of civics and law-related education, served on the civics subject matter development team for the C3 framework. How many of you know the C3 framework? Excellent. He served on the California Power of Democracy Advisory Group and the Judicial Council of California's Commission for Impartial Courts. He also headed the Constitutional Rights Foundation writing, this is an important part, civic learning writing team for the revision of the framework that we're going to talk about. So thank you, Marshall, for being with us today. So we have some slides. They're going to talk a little bit, and we're hoping to leave some time at the end for questions because I know you're going to have a number of them right now. So let's start first with Stephanie, who's with the California Department of Ed. Give us a little background, Stephanie, on how we got to this point, if you would.
Well, let's just say that this process started way back in 2008 when I had a first grader and now I have a high schooler. So we began the framework in 2008, as I said, with a series of focus groups of teachers held across the state, followed by the appointment of the Curriculum Framework and Evaluation Criteria Committee that prepared a draft framework in early 2009. You may recall that we had a bit of difficulty with the state budget around that time. In July 2009, just a few weeks after the draft framework had been approved for its first field review, the legislature passed and the governor signed. Sorry. Nice. Got to juggle and I had a cookie, so that's. The governor signed Assembly Bill X42. The law suspended all work on instructional materials and curriculum frameworks development until July 1st, 2013. The suspension was later extended to July 1st, 2015. What this meant is essentially we had to put our new draft on the shelf for a number of years. Okay. So in 2012, Senate Bill 1540 authorized the board to complete work on the framework with the stipulation that the project could only resume once the English language arts and the math framework were completed. Those frameworks were adopted in 2013 and 2014. They've been quite well received, at least we think so. But we knew that we would have a challenge in front of us when we resumed work on history, social science. In September 2014, work resumed. So we got that binder off the shelf, dusted it off, and resumed again with the Instructional Quality Commission sending out the draft framework for its second 60-day field review. The second 60-day field review took place between January and February of this year. During those reviews, we received a significant volume of public comment with over 11,000 emails and physical pieces of mail received altogether. Let me give you some perspective on this. We just finished our second 60-day field review for the California NGSS Science Framework, and we received 83 emails. Okay, so just some perspective there. In between and after those field reviews, the commission and our contracted writers at the California History Social Science Project, that's why we have wonderful Beth here, made extensive revisions to the draft in response to all the public comment. This framework has gone through more than a dozen public meetings, and I believe Board Member Strauss has sat through 8 hours of public comment, and we continue to get comments on it to this day. Next slide. Thank you. So now let's dive into the features. So that's the background, that's the history. So now we're here today. Let's dive into the features of the History Social Science Framework. It was adopted July 14th, 2016 by the State Board of Education. But between 2008 and 2016, quite a bit of legislation has passed since then. And so we had to make sure that that was addressed in the social science framework. So reflecting changes in state law, discussions of the contributions of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons, and the disabled were added throughout the framework. Various other references to the important contributions of other ethnic and cultural groups were also added. This slide shows a selection of other legislation passed since 2009 that affects the History Social Science Framework. A language that was added to the framework to address each one of these bills. So it is important to note that while this curriculum framework provides important guidance for the schools and will shape instructional decisions for some time to come, it is not intended to limit what can be taught in California classrooms. We're in the middle of an era of greater flexibility for local school districts, and that flexibility extends to the classroom teacher. The framework serves as a resource, a very important, well-researched, well-written resource. So with that, with some of our new features, we have all new course descriptions. The narrative course descriptions for kindergarten through grade 12 were completely rewritten to include recent scholarship and to add specific suggestions for teachers on how to address topics called for in the content standards. To make this framework consistent with other recent frameworks, new chapters on assessment, access and equity, instructional strategies, and professional learning were added to provide further support for teachers and administrators. And finally, several new appendices were added to the document, including suggestions for a thematic approach to teaching world history, an overview of the Education and Environment Initiative, and an essay on the capacities of literate individuals. The existing appendices on civic education, service learning, and religion in the teaching of history social science were revised and expanded. That's why we have about a 1,000-page document. I know, I'm sorry. Yes. So one very important feature that is very different in this framework from our old framework is that it is rooted in a strong emphasis on student inquiry. The framework calls upon students to conduct research, both guided and independently, evaluate primary and secondary sources, develop arguments, and make presentations. We want students to be actively involved in learning history. We want them to make evaluations on the primary source documents and make conclusions on their own. Okay. And all of this was based on, and I know Marshall's going to go further into the C3 framework, the College Career and Civic Life Framework for Social Studies Standards. Although it was not formally adopted by California, it includes an emphasis on inquiry arc and other concepts that we borrowed for our framework. We stole, right? That's what we do as teachers. Why reinvent the wheel?
Exactly. Collaborate.
Collaborate, that's right. So some other new features, speaking of collaboration, is that this framework also acknowledges the importance of the California's adoption of the California Common Core state standards for English language arts and literacy and history, social science, science and technical subjects, and the California English language development standards. The framework supports collaboration between teachers across disciplines and recognizes that student literacy and skill development is a cooperative enterprise. The framework includes suggestions for this collaboration and includes more than 20 different classroom examples from across the grade levels that show teachers how they can tailor instruction to address not only the history social science standards, but also the ELA literacy and ELD standards. So where are we now? Like I said, it was adopted on July 14th after 317 signed up public comments. That was a long day. It was a long day. So right now we have the framework posted on our website. It is not in its pretty final publication format, but the content is there. We're working on the editing and the finalized format for it. We're also in the process of recruiting instructional materials reviewers and content review experts for our instructional materials adoption. This is an extremely important process, because really the instructional materials for history, social science are what our students and our teachers see first. Our students don't necessarily see the framework, but they see the instructional materials that have to follow the guidance of the framework and the content standards. So we have flyers here at this event. Let's see, they look like this. So please, if you are interested in being part of this process, pick up a flyer and fill out our application. The training starts in late April of 2017, and deliberations are in July 2017. So if you have any vested interest in ensuring that the high quality materials are in our classrooms, please be a part of this process. It is open to everyone. Along with that notion of ensuring that we have high quality materials, we're also providing support to our publishers. We're providing specific publisher training around the content of the history social science framework. I was a teacher, and looking at those history social science textbooks that were just this large and a lot of text, a lot of vocabulary to memorize, we really are looking for them to make the textbooks look different according to the inquiry-based emphasis of our history social science framework. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Vice President Eileen Strauss.
So let me just build a little bit on what Stephanie said, and I thought I'd start. So you obviously you heard my background. I have a lot of experience in taking what the state does and getting it to happen in schools and classrooms. Last month I spent 6 days in Poland, in Krakow and Warsaw, and quite a bit of time at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Quite a moving and sobering visit. Just walking through, seeing where the train tracks were and where the young men went on one side, and the women and children and older people went on the other, and all the crematoriums. And then all the small Jewish quarters around Europe that no longer are inhabited by Jews. And so I think for me, it came alive. History came alive in a way that we can't always do for our kids when you're living it and seeing the stones that people walked over for their last breath. And so I thought about this, particularly with today's presentation, about our job really is to get this history framework to come alive for kids. And it isn't the old days of here's your textbook, read and answer the questions. That is just so important to think about. So when I talk to you about what I see as a practitioner and as a state policy member now about this framework, I'm going to talk to you about what we see as effective in helping to roll out and implement this framework. It's going to take a while, but for my granddaughter, my oldest granddaughter just started first grade, and I want her to get a sense of this framework and for her to get a sense of it and the little ones that come after her. How do we help teachers learn about this? So a lot of our frameworks have this 1,000-page size, or actually I think science is beating that. We're up at 1,200.
It's at 2,000 right now.
So what I wanted to do in my short few minutes on the panel is tell you what we're seeing as effective and helping to roll it out, and as districts going out, what can you do as teachers when you go back with your colleagues? What can you say to your principal and your district level leaders? So we do these amazing rollouts, and they happen all around the state, but my recommendation in those rollouts, it's a one-day conference, there's a panel, and then there's small breakouts, and we start to unpack some of it. Teams need to go. You can't go alone because you go back and there you are at your school. We need to have not just teachers, we need to have principals, and we need to have district instructional leaders, because when you're in your school talking about the new shifts in the C3 framework, principals in your conversation need to know what that is. So as district leaders, we need to help district leaders grow their knowledge of all of our frameworks. So when the rollouts come, I would encourage you to bring a team. If you want to be part of the materials review that Stephanie talked about, let me just tell you that you'll get trained on how to learn about the framework and how to review materials, and then you will get a palette of some materials at your school, hopefully, and not your backyard, because it's a lot of stuff. And then really, it's a lot of personal time to go through and see if the materials actually match what the framework says. It's a wonderful process, but very engaging and totally done by hundreds of teachers all over our state. So you meet some great people, and you work on a couple of the adoption processes. So again, it depends if you have little kids or aging parents, and you may not have as much time, but I just want to tell you, you will get a palette, just fair warning. So anyway. So I want to talk next about sort of what I see as the best effect we've had now. We're still working on our math rollout, and that happened a couple years ago. We've been doing English language arts, English language development for a couple years, and we've barely scratched the surface. So we try to help inform the history rollout with what we're learning. So when you are meeting with your department, so if you're a middle school and you're meeting with the whole history department, or if you're elementary and because the problem for elementary teachers, if there's any elementary teachers in the room, is that you still have that math, that literacy framework, you have this, and science is going to be adopted in November. So how do you manage all those pieces? I mean, you want to do it right, but there's a lot to manage. And we need to help the leaders help you figure out how to spend your time. So the clear message is, you can't just say, okay, now I'm just going to do this, and now I'm just going to do this. You're going to have to integrate. So one of the most wonderful things we've done is we've integrated English language development strategies across all of our frameworks. So just because you're teaching history doesn't mean you can't support your learners, all your learners, because our state of California philosophy is best first instruction is in your core classroom. And that's special needs kids, that's kids that are high achievers, they're kids that have challenges, and they're also, 95% of our kids and teachers in California have English learners in their classroom. So when you think about the professional learning time, I thought I'd give you a quick snapshot about some of the tools that you'll learn about when you go to the rollouts, that if you get 1,000 pages, you're just going to go to your chapter, you're not going to realize what richness is in this framework. So quickly, and these are things that we'll do more as the rollouts happen, are things called snapshots and vignettes. So they're real written. Some of you in this room, I think, have probably written a few of these. And they're great activities to do when your history department gets together. So you actually spend time unpacking that vignette of what fourth grade history would look like, what the activities are, what the literacy strategies are, and then you can plan lessons to match that. So the vignettes are longer and the snapshots are shorter, and they're great tools. We found great use as we've trained people on the literacy framework to use some of that. And so another piece of the framework that we'll see that's across all of our frameworks are these charts that have strategies. So it'll give you literacy strategies for all kids. So if you see on the left-hand side, you'll see all those, and this is in the framework. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see how to enhance for English learners. It's a great tool. So you could be sitting at a department meeting, or in my opinion, a faculty meeting, saying, this is what we do, whether we're a K-5 school, whether we're middle school, whether we're a high school, because everybody's touching literacy no matter what their content is, even in health, even in mathematics. So here are some strategies we should all be doing, but just look what the state of California resources gave us. Here are the literacy for English learners. So my recommendation is, when you think about charts, snapshots, and vignettes, that those become part of your local work when you're meeting with the history in elementary, or when the high school history department gets together and say, let's take one vignette and let's look at it. Let's take a look at this chart and see how it would work. So what we're finding is, and you know this, Civic, this is not the best professional development design. But if we just say, okay, history department, go work on it, plan a lesson, unless we show you where the materials are and actually focus your work around something new, you'll practice and work on what you know best and need time to do. So my best experience research-based is to focus the professional time among colleagues collaboratively, but using the tools that we've provided in this framework. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes highlighting that and tell you, this is a great time to think about how it's going to come alive for our next generation of kids. Okay. So with that, I'm putting my grandchildren in your hands, and certainly know that when you see the rollout coming, get a team and go to that. Yeah. It will be so exciting for you who are here on a Saturday at the Reagan Library. When Joanne and I walked through really quickly and took a look at the Berlin Wall, which I saw last spring, and think about the reality of what happened behind that wall, and that we need to make that come alive for our kids.
Okay. Thank you, Stephanie and Eileen. Those are great comments. A lot of us in this room have felt that the social studies have been marginalized for some time. So this is a great opportunity for this framework to put us front and center in a cohesive, well-rounded, educative way. And look for those rollouts. If you're on my LACO History Social Science listserv, you're going to get that information. If you want to join, I'll put a sign-out sheet there, because those will be coming out within this school year. It's going to be a collaborative effort organized by the state board, the county office, and the Department of Ed. So we're very excited. All right, so you got kind of the big picture stuff. And this is struggling for us because we want to go into depth, and this is just a snapshot you're getting. I want to drill down a little bit on the content of the framework itself. It centers on 4 themes: content, literacy, inquiry, and citizenship. So I'm going to ask Beth here to start us off, talk a little bit about content and literacy and the emphasis of that in the framework.
Sure. Okay, let me advance.
There you go.
Okay, so I, along with my colleagues across the state, I work at UC Davis, we're some of the authors on the framework. And I'm going to quickly explain this slide because Stephanie gave some of the background on it. But in short, when the framework was finally up for renewal, or when it was about to be revisited, Eileen and her colleagues said to us, here's what we would like you to do. We would like you to create this framework that's aligned with all of these other incredibly important documents, especially California's newly adopted ELA-ELD framework, and the Common Core State Standards and the C3 framework that also aligns with the content standards, which have not changed. And so the task before us was create a coherent narrative of history social studies that addresses all of these state-adopted documents, which are all terrific documents in and of themselves, but also tell the history and the social studies through it. And while you're doing that, So that's what the list on the left is sort of, here's the documents that you should take into consideration. And on the right side is, and while you're doing it, you should also be sure to incorporate, this is a small list of some of the pieces of legislation that were adopted between the last revision in the early 2000s and 2016. So while you're revisiting and updating history, make sure that students pay special attention to financial literacy. Coming out of the financial crisis in 2008, students absolutely must learn financial literacy. This is something that's lacking. Make sure you also pay attention to the significance of the Irish potato famine. And there's a list of content material that we also had to include, and we had to include it in a smart way that aligns with all of these other state-adopted documents. So the task was pretty intense, which was compounded by the intense, often competing public feedback that we received, and that Joanne, who's sitting in the front row, can certainly attest to, as we all received these tens of thousands of emails, and we felt compelled as professionals and as educators and citizens to critically engage with all of them. After all, this is a democratic process, and we want everyone's voice to be included. So this was our goal over the past 18 months or so. Now, what developed out of this is a framework that I think the whole state should be proud of, because working as a collaborative effort with all of these wonderful education agencies, with historians, with teachers, with the public, with policymakers, we created this vision of instructional practice that has 4 areas of emphasis. So we created a framework that has, we're calling it 4 areas of focus, or 4 main components now. These are the 4 things that I think are included in all smart history social science classes. The themes are content, literacy, inquiry, and citizenship. So I'm going to just quickly go through the 2 developments of content and literacy, and then we can circle back to the others. Okay, now as for the content, the small preview that I'm going to give you, and just out of curiosity, I'm curious to know, has anyone opened the framework and taken a look at their grade level chapter? Okay, good. That's where I would start if I was you. I mean, do not be overwhelmed or fine. I would start with the introduction, which is short. It's a manageable 20 pages that are double spaced. And then I would go to your grade level chapter. Now, if you're a US history teacher, and when I say US history teacher, I mean kindergarten through 5th grade, because we imagine even at, say, K3, where social studies looks more local, we imagine this as part of US history. And what we tried to do with all of US history, K5, and then 6th and 7th is, of course, world history, and 8th grade is US history, and then 9th grade is geography, or in some districts, ethnic studies, and there's other electives, or 11th grade modern US history, or 12th grade government and econ. What we tried to do is we tried to present themes that connect all of the content across the grade level. Themes that connect content, whether we're talking about early California history, Native American interactions in the British colonies, whether we're talking about the American Civil War, whether we're talking about immigration in the 20th and 21st centuries. We saw that there's common themes that unite all of US history. So the 3 themes that connect US history that we identified for teachers would be movement, identity, and freedom, and there's some overlap here. Now, the way that we've tried to draw out these themes is by creating these things that we call framing questions. Framing questions, which I know Robbie will probably touch on a little bit, they're essentially inquiry questions to help teachers develop their lessons around this model of historical investigation. So if you think about what movement means as a theme, some of the questions that are embedded are things like, how did people move to my local community? Think about 2nd grade history or 3rd grade history. Or in 4th grade, why did California become so diverse? Or in 5th grade, how did the British colonies look similar and different depending on who migrated there? Or in 11th grade, why did the continental United States become a global power? So things like, why do people move across space, and how does this affect time? The topic of identity, we mean here, what goes into creating someone's identity? Whether at the elementary level, it's what makes a leader in my community, whether they're creating that as a class, or whether they're working on something at, here, wait, I have a couple of examples I wanted to share with you. Let's see, how are leaders selected? Oh, and then think about ethnic studies, something that's, in so much discussion, especially in Southern California and parts of the Bay Area. Think about like these competing identities. Students like to talk so much about this concept of intersectionality. So is it someone's race, class, ethnicity, sexuality that creates their identity, and is it a blend of it all? Themes in world history, I'll come back to freedom and we'll talk about it at the end. So themes in world history that we really wanted to develop are themes that can help convey a much more global sense of the past. The idea with world history in 6th and 7th and 10th grade is to get away from this Western civilization narrative that dominates so many of the textbooks, and to really get into a global sense of the past, whether we're talking about 6th grade ancient world history, when we talk about, say, the significance of the environment in shaping the ways and the places that people live, or sites of encounter, which is a different model of doing history that doesn't just always emphasize like the wars and the famines, but it emphasizes the way that people have interacted in multiple ways. Okay, all of this lays out in all of the content area chapters. And embedded within all of the content area chapters is an explicit emphasis on the importance of literacy in history social science instruction. Because our thinking is that in order to be able to truly understand the past, students must be able to read about it independently, write about it, and communicate about it in all levels. So throughout the framework, we have integrated how literacy development happens in a history social science classroom. So here's 3 of the areas that I'm not going to read this slide to because I know I'm running out of time and I want to make sure that the other areas get as much time. But there's a lot of literacy discussion in the instructional practices overview. So the way that the framework is divided is there's a K-5 instructional practice overview, a 6-8, and then a 9-12 instructional practice overview, where students or where teachers are given like this very practical scope and sequence of how literacy development occurs alongside history. There's a great section on literacy in the Access and Equity chapter, which has been totally rewritten, that provides some really great resources that I encourage you to all get in touch with. And then in the grade level course descriptions, I think is some of the meatiest literacy development, where in the vignettes and the grade level course, or in the vignettes and the snapshots that Eileen mentioned, we have really specific examples of, say, in a 5th grade classroom, when you're learning about the Declaration of Independence, you might want to do a close read of this passage by doing sentence deconstruction on these 2 sentences, and here's how you should line it up. So it's our goal to integrate the content and the literacy side by side. Okay, thank you. On to you.
Well, that's a lot. See, now you know you have to come to the rollout to get more. All right, Rob's going to talk to us. Tell us a little more about that inquiry piece, because this really changes the dynamic of teaching.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Beth, for bringing us to this point in those 4 themes. The inquiry piece is really, really important in that it really gives kids more ownership, or at least an opportunity to take more ownership of the learning, right? Which is incredibly different from what we were up against in the NCLB era, which was a lot of, I've got to cover my content, especially in my work with secondary history teachers who were preparing kids for AP exams, or frankly just getting kids ready for CSTs, and it was really a mad dash to cover the content. We're shifting, but I want to share with you very quickly, before we get into this inquiry piece in depth, that our old framework, the 2005 edition, it actually did more than just lay out content standards. In my own case, in the 8th grade U.S. history class, I had 69 substandards to cover, right? 8.1 through 8.12, and then you add up the 8.1.1 all the way through 8.12.7, and I had 69, quote, substandards to cover, right? And I had an 8th grade CST for my students that covered 30% on ancient civilizations, 30% on world, and 40% on U.S. So how we ever expected a 13-year-old to remember what he or she learned as an 11-year-old 2 years later was beyond me. But the inquiry piece, in my mind, was always part of that framework. We didn't pay much attention to it, generally speaking, but if you look at the goals that are up on that wheel, there's a lot more there than just knowledge or knowledge of the content. And I'll drill down on this idea a little bit. So you can see on, I believe it's your left or your right, those large aspirational goals, which I think in large measure, specifically in the school district where I worked, they were typically unknown. I don't want to say ignored, but a lot of us just did not open the framework. And frankly, there were a lot of great grade level introductions in that framework. There was some good research that I think supported the claims in that research as well, and not just around the content. If you look at this single page here, it appears, and this is what our old framework looked like, right?
And mine looks like that too.
It was pretty big, yeah, mine's pretty worn out. It's not just a prop. I actually travel with that quite a bit. But at the end of every grade level set, K5, 6, 8, and 9, 12, you'll see a page like this in that 2005 framework. And those categories, they call them intellectual skills. There are 3 big categories of intellectual skills: chronological spatial thinking, research, evidence, point of view, and the chronological and spatial thinking. I can't really see that, I just pretended there. So it just came to me. But if we drill down on that a little bit.
Keep going.
Thank you. You'll notice this is one example from K5. If you read that real quick to yourself, you'll see that this sort of intellectual skill cannot be acquired through a PowerPoint presentation, right? Or a rush through the content and complete the handout sort of work. And by the way, I'm not poo-pooing PowerPoint and handouts. There's a place for that. They should support the learning that goes on as well. But most of us were not setting up our instruction through an inquiry process. And therefore, in my mind, we weren't developing these sorts of skills. Look at this research evidence and point of view skill that 6th through 8th graders were supposed to acquire by the time they got to 9th grade. And by the time kids were moving on to college, they were supposed to be able to do this in terms of historical interpretation. These are heavy intellectual skills. In fact, the quote that, if you look at the very top of that grade, I think it's 912 there, they all start like this: the intellectual skills noted below are to be learned through and applied to the content standards for kindergarten through grade 5. In this case, it'll say grade 9 through 12, right? So these were the sorts of skills kids were supposed to be acquiring in addition to learning the content. So our previous framework was not just that which kids should know, it was always that which kids should also be able to do, right? And I share that only because with this new framework coming out, we have an opportunity not just to reinvent our own instruction, but reinvent the experience that kids have, to really make history come alive, and frankly, to have kids fall in love with learning in general, right? When we do this sort of instruction, I think that happens more naturally. I think it's going to happen more often. Which brings us to the pedagogical framework that we've all already alluded to, the college, career, and civic life framework. This has been referred to in our new framework. As Stephanie mentioned, it's not formally adopted, but I think, given the amount of times it's been referenced in these 23 chapters of the new framework, we all have a mandate now to make that part of what we do in our classrooms, the C3 framework. They outline, as a pedagogical framework, they outline these 4 dimensions of inquiry. So the first is planning inquiries and developing questions. And like you, I'm sure, I was always trying to help kids develop good questions, good inquiries, but we need to work a little bit harder on helping them develop the questions and plan their own inquiries as we do this. Compelling questions, I think was alluded to. We call them framing questions or essential questions. Compelling questions compel kids to learn more deeply and to think about it more deeply. Think about the content, I should say, more deeply. Dimension 2 is applying disciplinary concepts. So a great example, I'm just going to read this real quick. One way to do that is to frame questions in specific ways. Here's a compelling question framed through the history lens. When did Americans gain their liberty? A lot of us might immediately think 1776, but it depends on how you define Americans. It depends on how you define liberty. This is an enduring question, which is how we define a compelling question. Planning inquiries also requires that we develop supporting questions to go along with those. And we want students on a regular basis to be gathering and evaluating evidence in credible ways. And then finally, we want not only them to take the opportunity to communicate the conclusions that they've drawn based on evidence, but we want them to take some form of action. And that brings us to Marshall.
So this is really the pivotal point right here, is how do we apply what we're learning and teaching to today? That's the whole piece on citizenship. Marshall was a major contributor to the framework to that, so I'm excited you're here, Marshall. Talk to us more about this aspect.
And I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad all of you are here. Probably the biggest link to Constitution Day with all of this is the issues in the new framework about the theme of citizenship, and certainly how do we help create effective, engaged, informed citizens. Our view is, of course, that a primary purpose of public education, certainly history, social science education, is the creation of citizens and participants in civil life that can make the kinds of decisions, that can ask the kinds of questions that we need to be asked, that will stay informed, that will participate in the democratic institutions. So we think that's a very key thing. And we were very happy that the State Department of Education and certainly other collaborators believed that enhancing the civic learning components of the existing framework was an important thing to do. So our work was, I think I'm on the right slide yet?
Yeah, nope. Push one more. There you
go. Our work was funded by the Los Angeles County Office of Education. It was administered by the Sacramento County Office of Education. It was directed by a very gifted and a mentor of mine, Dr. Gary DeRossi, in collaboration with the State Department, or the California Department of Education. And it was written by Constitutional Rights Foundation. And by I mean that, our senior writing team, including me, and I think Damon's back there.
Here he is.
There's Damon Huss, and Bill Hayes, and Carrie Doggett all worked on different aspects of it. Very closely in collaboration with the History Project and Gary. And when we started this process, we realized that we wanted a citizen, or a citizen being prepared for citizenship, with a wide range of capacities beyond voting. And though voting is crucial, think of all the other things that are necessary for a citizen to do in our society if we're going to thrive and survive as a democratic republic. And we think that includes understanding and evaluating public policy, understanding and knowing how to influence the political decision-making process, developing a range of skills and behaviors, including civic writing, presentations, discussion, deliberation of public issues, and taking civic action in the real world. All of these are things that citizens and participants in civic life need to be able to do. And picking up on Rob's point, we were very much influenced by the C3 framework. And just as we call it an inquiry arc, I think we can also call it a civic learning arc. I'm just going to spend a minute or so on that idea. But if you think of it, almost every serious issue that we're confronted with as a public involves the raising of important questions, compelling and supporting questions. You take the recent the public debates and controversy about the use of police force. The compelling questions that each one of those presents us, such as what is justice? What is due process? What is equal protection? Then supporting questions. What governs police behavior? What governs the use of deadly force or reasonable force? Every issue that comes out and we are confronted with as a citizen has those kinds of questions and must be answered. And a citizen has to learn how to find out the answers to those questions. So we see that that it's important that not only do we raise the questions, but we consider sources and evaluate sources about how to answer those questions. The second part of the framework, the C3 that I thought was important, is the interdisciplinary content. Very few issues, public issues, and issues of public policy exist in a vacuum. A learner, a citizen, cannot grapple with the kinds of questions that they're asked to deal with one discipline. Almost every issue has a range of different disciplines involved. Let me give you an example. You know, we have the recent example of Russian incursion into the Ukraine. And what should US policy be? And what should European policy be? Well, it's obviously also a big issue within the recent presidential race. But how can a citizen understand this without a historical understanding? They have to understand why Russia wants to go into Crimea in the first place. They have to understand the economics, the oil exchanges between Russia and Eastern Europe. They have to understand certainly the political considerations of what are treaties, what are obligations, but nothing exists in a vacuum. So that's important. Then the next one might be the most important or among them, and that is how do we evaluate sources? Today in our country and the world, in fact, we have a lot of information, but a lot of it is questionable and is obviously from a particular point of view. I sometimes call it the entertainment news media, the partisan news media, the fringe news media, and the good news media. They're all out there, but you have to be able to tell them apart. You have to be able to evaluate them. There's nothing more important than being able to make those decisions. And then the final thing is taking action. And what we tried to do in this new framework is to make sure that everything that happened is taking action within the classroom and outside of the classroom. So we want to make sure, and so we went grade by grade. We enhanced the civic learning content. We put in the proven practices of civic education to make sure that there was going to be discussion, that there was going to be linkage of historical to contemporary. The 12th grade was particularly strengthened with that kind of thing, with a focus on taking action in the classroom and outside of the classroom on real world issues. And we also added civic learning skills to the historical and social studies analysis skill that's already in there. The appendices were also improved, were the civics appendice, service learning, which is one of the promising approaches. We want to talk about the intentionality of service learning specifically to increase citizenship skills. And then, of course, the California 3 Rs is to help provide guidance and support for teachers in teaching about religion, another crucial lens. So that was basically the focus of our and we hope it's helpful. I mean, for us, the history social studies teacher is the bulwark of democracy. You have the primary responsibility for making sure our democracy is going to survive. We want to give you as many tools and as much help as we can, but believe me, you are the future.
Thank you, Marshall. Thank you very much. There you go. So if you've been coming to Constitution Days, you're hearing a lot about the importance of raising the importance of civic learning to preparing all young people to be active and engaged citizens. I think we would all agree that if we can teach history, social science in this way, we're doing our job. We're applying what kids learn from the past to issues of today. And that's what's going to create the knowledge, the skills, and the attitudes for them to be engaged citizens. Look at this election coming up, folks. Man, we need smart, critical thinkers more than ever, right? Many would say our democracy is in peril right now if we don't do the work of preparing the next generation. We have a few minutes for questions, so I'm sure this is generating lots of questions. Tony's going to help us here with mics, and Rebecca. So don't be shy. You got all the experts up here. Come on, now's your chance. Questions about social studies in general in California, what's going on, and with this framework. Thank you. Tell us your name, where you're from.
Jacqueline Hernandez from Parkview Elementary in El Monte.
We have a
Mountain
lot of
View School
elementary
District.
folks here today, so this is very important to them. Thank you.
And, well, I have a question. It was briefly discussed that the testing expected children to remember what they learned in 5th grade throughout. How is the testing going to change now? What do you foresee coming?
So all the testing, as you know, for history, social science has been suspended. Dr. Strauss, do you have any updates on assessment I don't want to put you on the spot, for history, social science?
So with AB 484, when they were suspended, the Department of Ed has to go back to the legislature with a recommendation. In the recommendation, there is a recommendation for history, social science assessment at the end of each grade span. That has not gone into legislation yet. There's no action yet. So I think it's in process, but at least in the input, that is one of the recommendations in our current, you might know, Thursday was a pretty big day for us at State Board when we adopted the new accountability. In the accountability right now, there's a recommendation for a science assessment when it's ready to go in at each grade span. But the history is, I believe, the pathway for that will come with the CDE recommendation, California Department of Education's recommendation to the legislature, because they have to do that on AB 484. And then we'll see based on that what happens with development. I don't know if any of you want to add anything to that.
I would just add that we have this golden moment right now in the social studies where
No test.
we have an opportunity to learn and grow with each other and with one another about how we do inquiry well, because I think all of us have a lot to learn about that, myself included. And without testing hanging over our heads, and frankly over our principals' heads, we have this grace period where we can get good at this now, right? And I don't have to tell you, you're all here on a Saturday, right? So to our colleagues, we want to encourage them to come out of their classrooms and work in those PLCs, look at that introduction, chapter 1, read our grade level chapters, and then really dig in around the pedagogical framework that is the C3 and figure out, how do we do this? How do we do this in a really engaging way that makes our subject come alive and helps them take ownership of the problems in their classrooms, their schools, and communities? And that, to me, is a moment we shouldn't waste.
I agree with Rob. I get this question all the time, because we've had to go fast, but we've never had permission to go deep. So I say to schools, have the conversation with your administrators at your sites. Get some permission to go deep, maybe go fast in some areas, but to do it right. This is an exciting opportunity. Let's think of it that way and grab it. Here's a question. Ruth's got a question back here. And there's another question.
Well, hi,
let's
Michelle,
get Scott
and
while
hi,
we're on
Rob.
our way. Scott Petrie, who's president of the Southern California Social Science Association.
Why, thank you. Rob, I really, your comments resonated with me, and I think the standards movement, and I call it sprinting along the coverage treadmill, has really killed a lot of creativity in social studies instruction. And I remember doing a 5th grade research project on the Pony Express that really probably made me become a history teacher. How do we change the culture of curriculum mapping and district assessments and make it more based on performance assessments and meaningful work that our students can do?
Big picture for me, Scott, has always been that the content was the platform upon which I built critical thinking and literacy skills, right? Most of my 8th graders read at the 1st and 2nd grade level. And I knew that they would not be able to even come close to passing a Casey test unless I was putting at the heart of everything I did their ability to discern that which is credible and that which is not credible evidence, and then be able to cite that evidence in real ways. We used to do a project called Create a Country in our grade level that our principal tried to shut down once all the content standards were delineated. And we had to be able to articulate to our site administrators about the deep learning that was going on, both the critical thinking and the creative thinking, as well as the literacy piece. I'm not opposed to curriculum mapping. I think we should know where we're going and what we're doing that day and that week and the next month, and be able to talk about, you know, common assessments across our grade level. I don't think that needs to go away, but I think we just need to frame it in the context. We've got to do learning more deeply, not more wide.
And that's why this is an opportunity. We're not driven by a test right now. So let's be creative. Let's do it the way we've wanted to for a long time. You hear me, elementary folks? I feel that. Okay, Ruth.
Hi, my name is Ruth Luevnos. I teach at Holmes Middle School, and my question is, you know, what is the California Department of Education and the county offices of education going to do? And one of the words that I heard that I love to hear was flexibility, and teachers having flexibility. And it seemed like the same discussion that Scott had at his school is what I heard at my school, that all the creativity went out the window and the deep inquiry learning went out the window when standards was imposed. And those were not my words, that was at my new school that I heard. So what is the CDE going to do and administrators going to be doing to be held accountable to allow teachers the flexibility to not say, because I'm already hearing from certain school districts and teachers across the state that this is being, you know, this is how you're going to do inquiry, teachers, you know, in this district, and this is the program you're going to use. You know, when are we going to be allowed the flexibility and support to teach our students best, because we know them best?
So I really think that comes through getting your teams together to go to the launch events around the history social science framework. You're going to get a lot of deep diving within the framework and the content, and the idea is that we want you to go in depth. We want students to be entrenched in the historical pieces of history. We want them to become characters within the history events. You know, we want history to come alive for them. In order for that to happen, teachers need time. Right? You need time to make that happen. Right now, as Michelle and Rob have said, we don't have an assessment hanging over our head right now. We have the opportunity to learn the framework. We have an opportunity to learn the content. We have the opportunity to provide professional development, continuous professional development that keeps coming back and it's ongoing around the flexibility for teachers. Yeah, I know Dr. Strauss wants to
we're
add.
about at time, so I'm going to let Dr. Strauss finish
this
us out.
You know, under Governor Brown's administration and his support, led by Dr. Michael Kirst, who's our state board president, was also Governor Brown's state board president during his first 2 terms. There's a theory of subsidiarity, meaning the state sets the expectation, provides the resources, but under local context, it's implemented. But with a balance of accountability, so there's some direction and priorities as to what we believe is really important. So we can't expect at a state our size with the 6 million plus kids that the state can control and impact and direct this is what's going to happen. But so basically we've set the standards, we've set in state accountability, implementing academic standards is a requirement. We're providing lots of resources and tools. We got $1,400 an educator on the last budget for professional development to be determined at the local level. Mm-hmm. The LCAP, Local Control Accountability Plan, is written to address state priorities, but with local input and then supervised by the county. So I'm saying the system is there's pieces in place. It plays out differently in local districts. In my career, I've worked in 4 different districts. Each had its own local politics, each had its local issues. Your voice and input in the local process matters. So a teacher's voice, there's very clear discussion in local districts about the need for professional time. Districts do it differently. Late start, early release, full days, Saturdays. Subs are hard to get right now, so we're having a hard time doing that. But districts are really clear that there's money, both that $1,400 for education, for educators, and then also in the plans that you write and get approved in your local districts, How will you invest in professionals to accomplish those goals? So I would say there's a process that is expected at the local level to articulate and input how that time is used. And I would just argue it isn't just give us the time we know best. It has to be focused around the frameworks, around the tools that we highlighted today, around practicing and looking at each other teach and planning lessons. That's how we're going to improve our practice for our kids.
So stay tuned, watch for rollouts, get on the listservs. Your county office of education is an extension of the Department of Ed to provide support. Rob's office, Orange County, LA County. I know there's someone here from Ventura County. Where are you? There she is. So that will be a resource for you as well. So you've got the first heads up on this overview of the framework. So you are in the know and got on your way.
And I would just say, it's an exciting time. There's funding, there's support, there's materials, and there's time for you to work on it. So I think this is a great time to be working on this.
I want to thank Joanne Iskin, who's been our timekeeper. She's former chair of the Instructional Quality Commission. And truly want to thank my wonderful panel who drove and flew great distances to share this great information with you. Thank you to all of you, and it means so much that you're here. Thank you.